and destruction and death. That just seemed like a bummer. So instead, we kept walking further into the black gum swamp, where the oldest tree in the Harvard forest stands. And I thought, well, that would be cool. That's a beautiful tree. You know, it's gnarled, it's big, it's got bark like an alligator. But I thought not that many people know this kind of tree. You know, the black gum tree, they're just not going to relate to it. They probably don't have one in their yard. So we kept going. And when we came into this one particular part of the forest, John put his hand on a big tree, really big tree, and he said, this one might be the right one for you. And here it is, my witness tree. It's a single red oak in the Harvard forest. And as you can see, it's pretty darn big. It's a dominant tree, the biggest thing in its grove. And you know, and it lives in a liminal space. It's amid a wild wood with other animals of every sort, this beautiful little red F salamander, the lovely amphibians of every sort. I love the frogs. The tree frogs sing to us out there. Birds, of course. And you know, it's lived across time and across many seasons and over many, many years. And we found out just how many years last year. We courted last spring, and we found out that it reveals this twined human and natural history of about 100 years. And it's the carbon cycle, really. That's what a tree is. It's the carbon cycle made visible because of the sun and the water and the CO2 that a tree uses to create its very body. It's an amazing transubstantiation from these quicksilver beautiful elements into the solidness of wood. So it's the carbon cycle made visible, and it's also an ecologic and historical timeline. And in the story of this one tree, we can explore the forest, the biosphere, our own changing relationship with nature over that 100 years, and what I like to call our carbon love affair, right? Engines, cars, all kinds of fossil fuels, and their consequences. My tree is also a historical marker, and the reason for that is this stone wall. It sprouted by this stone wall back in about 1905 from an acorn, and what the stone wall tells us is that this landscape is a recovered and recovering landscape, completely deforested back in about the 1700s by people who came to settle this place and put farms there. But they left. They left in about 1860 because of the coming of the Erie Canal and the opening of markets to the west, to the populous east, which made it much more profitable for people to ditch these stony New England soils, these tiny little upland farms, and go to the Midwest where they could do serious farming at big scale. And so they did. They either left to go farm there, or they went for jobs in the cities, the mill towns. And the human-caused climate change that results from the fossil fuels that we've been burning ever since the last 150 years has accelerated the climate change that we're living today. My tree is also a scientific instrument. It is a tagged, tracked specimen in the Harvard forest, which is about an hour-and-a-half west of Boston. In central Massachusetts, it's 4,000 acres of natural wood that the Harvard University has been using as an outdoor laboratory since 1907. And my tree is a specimen in a long-term study of how seasons are changing because of climate change. What does it mean as the seasons themselves begin to change? How does that alter the ecology of the forest? That's what scientists are looking for, the signature of climate change on the land and its results. So in the second chapter of my book, I introduce people to my tree. It is a dominant tree. It's the biggest thing where it grows. But you know, it's also a beneficent monarch. Oak trees are incredible. They enable the lives of so many other animals. This little hole belongs to a tiny little chipmunk that I saw darting in there with an acorn one day. You know, it also supports all sorts of birds. The acorns from oak trees support everything from deer to bear to, of course, all sorts of birds. Every other sort of insect lives on its leaves. Their leaves are always shredded by the end of the season by all kinds of animals that have been eating them. It's interesting, oaks have such a struggle with caterpillars in the spring. They can actually change the physical chemistry of their leaves to make them less palatable. And, I love this part, They can actually send out a pheromone to call in an airstrike of predatory wasps to take out these caterpillars that are devouring them. And it gets better. The surrounding oak trees can detect that pheromone and also gear up to protect themselves against caterpillars. Who knew that these trees communicated in that way? They also communicate below ground. They share roots and nutrients. And so when you see a tree like this, it is spectacular. In every season, it is always doing something. They are also a kind of king of the forest. You know, oak trees are the most common tree in the Northern Hemisphere. And since we've lost the American chestnut, they feed more insects, more animals, a larger suite of life than any other tree. They're also very beloved by people and always have been. You know, they're fantastic building material. They basically were the building material for the British Navy back in the day. And for us, even at the Harvard Forest, one of the first things that happened when I moved in out there was the arrival of these guys with these big beams cut from the Harvard Forest, sweet, tangy red oak, to replace the sills at the house where I live, which was built in 1762. They jacked it up, they put in these new sills, and we'll be living on these red oak sills now for probably another 100 years. So that's red oak for you. It's beautiful, it's functional in a wide ecosystem in the forest, and it's been dear to people always. Chapter 3, in the book I want to talk in chapter 3 about, well, what does it mean to know a tree? What does it take? That's me climbing the tree. It's so tall, I really needed professional help, ropes, harness, helmet, the whole bit. The reason I did that was I wanted to feel what it was like up there, to be in its realm, to see its view into the forest, and even just feel it under my feet. I was so used to looking up at it, I wanted to see what it was like to be in its realm. I'm not the first one to love a tree or be interested in it. We've been fascinated with trees always. It started way back trying to figure out, well, just like, how do they work? What is the physiology of a tree? What is it made of? How does it get its nutrition? What is photosynthesis? You know, people spent centuries trying to understand this, and we're still at it. Out at the Harvard Forest, there was a lot of really newfangled work going on last summer with this gentleman from Washington State University who was probing into the phloem of leaves, of trunks. That's the plumbing that runs up and down the tree to try to figure out what was the actual pressure, differential pressure between the phloem so that you could get movement of fluid through the different cells. You know, the thing that was so cool about Michael, and I want you to notice this, he saw it as an artist too, not only a scientist. He took pictures and dyed cells within the tree to produce these incredible views inside the deep functioning elements of a tree. And so as you think about how you'll do your own scientific investigations, know that you can do them as an artist too, as a writer, as a poet, whatever speaks to you. Because there's so much to enjoy. The wonder of leaves, photosynthesis, the gifts that trees are to our planet, and what they're trying to tell us. You know, these stomata are the little openings on the undersides of leaves through which they breathe. There are millions of them. They breathe in CO2. They breathe out the oxygen that we depend on. And what's really interesting is, as you look at leaves today in a modern specimen, if you were to compare it to an old specimen from an herbaria, very likely, very often, what we see is fewer stomata in the modern leaf. Think about that. Why would that be? It's because there's so much CO2 in the atmosphere, they don't need as many mouths. And for them, it's a trade-off. They can lose less water vapor if they have fewer openings. So if they can get just as much CO2 with fewer openings, that's good for them. To me, that says something. That is a leaf, that is a tree telling us in its very physiology about our changing world. Chapter 4, I look at the Harvard Forest itself, this beautiful pasture with these cows. That's my view out my back door. Those cows are more than cows. They're historic re-enactors. What do I mean by that? Well, David Foster, the director of the Harvard Forest, took out the trees that were in this pasture in about the 1990s and put back the cows so that when people come out to visit, they will see what was really the dominant landscape here through at least 1760, 1770, 80, 1800, and forward. And it, you know, in the time of Thoreau, writing out there at Walden Pond was the peak of deforestation in New England. And what's important to recognize is that forest you see in the background has grown back since then. So what we see in New England is an incredible story of a transformed landscape. So here are these cows. I think one of the things I've found interesting is that they are the most charismatic attraction at the Harvard Forest. Whenever somebody comes to visit, that's the first thing they do is go talk to the cows. I think that there is a kind of connection between people and land and animals that goes very deep, whether they are these sorts of animals or wild animals. We're meant to care about these places, and we do. This winter, I was digging around in the Harvard archives just to try to learn a little bit more about what life was really like for people during that time of farming in New England. And this was a very good thing for me to do, because it's easy for me to say, gosh, it would be great if we just kind of backed off our industrial way of life today and went more back to the way it used to be. The way it used to be for people was very tough. I mean, she had 6 children, and 3 of them are buried right next door at the Harvard Forest. Most of them died in their early years. One of them lived to be 1 year, 10 months, another one only 10 years. And her life, as I say here in this slide, was an endless string of verbs. And they weren't very fun verbs. You know, they were churned, washed, scrubbed. She was a housewife between 1861 and 1862, and her life was very, very hard. And so as we think about what will we do about the climate change problem, we need to think about how will we balance the lives that we have come to love and know with the lives that our planet can support? And what about the people who still don't have these lives today, who desperately would love to have any of the things that we already do? This is the local cemetery where her children are buried. Chapter 5. In this part of the book, I talk about trees themselves as timekeepers, as scribes. I didn't know this about trees until I started hanging out with some of the people at the Harvard Forest, where there are people there who know how to core trees and read that core for the history that a tree tells. And it's incredible what a tree knows. You know, if you look at the core of a tree, you can see, did it live closely with its neighbors? Did a tree near it fall over and it suddenly had a big surge of growth? Was there a fire? Was there a spate of much more rain? You can see all that in a tree. You can also go to a landscape like the Pisgah Forest in New Hampshire, where Harvard University has a tract of old-growth white pine. They bought that tract because almost all of it had been cut by the time they bought it. And you know what? A couple months later, it all blew down. In the hurricane of 1938, you can go to that place today and see the hurricane. You can hear it in your mind as you look at these trees. It's incredible, isn't it, how big that is? And to think of an entire forest just being flattened in a matter of hours. It's really a vision of a lost world. And I think, too, that, you know, when you think about what a tree endures, bug attacks, ice storms, fire, and so forth, there's so much to see in the single life of one tree. So now we're the hurricane. As you look at the Harvard Forest, you see a changing landscape, and it's changing in ways that we can actually see. As trees bud and leaf out, which is a beautiful thing to see, I really encourage you to come out and see the Harvard Forest starting in about April and into May. It's an incredible pageant of an unfolding spring. Look at an oak leaf when it's tiny. It looks like a mouse, doesn't it? Look how pink and furry it is. You know, as the forest breathes in, it is a signal that's actually visible at the planetary scale. This reforestation of the New England area is so significant, it actually has changed the atmospheric composition of the planet. This is John O'Keefe, who has been walking a circuit of the same 50 trees for 25 years to watch the procession of the seasons. And trees tell the truth. They are not raising funds. They're not running for office. They only are what they are. And you know what? Here's what John sees. As he's walked this wood, he's seen that the amplitude of the seasonal swing has increased, which tells us these northern forests are working harder as CO2 increases in the atmosphere. And with his long-term records, we can see earlier spring, later fall, winter, it's getting squeezed on both ends. I think global warming is a very insufficient, even misleading term. It doesn't capture the reality of what's going on. You know, we're changing not just temperatures, but the timing of the seasons and the function of the planet itself. So what do we observe on these walks? We look at everything, not just trees. We look at native plants. Look at the wildflowers. You know, the Harvard forest has not been hammered by deer. We look at a lot of New England forests and they are just scraped down to nothing but dust. That's not true here. Hunting is allowed in the forest and the population is in balance. If you want to see the wildflowers of a New England wood, that's the place to go. Everything, violets, lady slippers. Vernal pools, we watch these closely. When trees go dormant, it's interesting how high up the water level comes. They're not drawing up water for their photosynthetic machinery. Trees are links between the atmospheric and the terrestrial realm. As they work, they draw up water. As they shut down, vernal pools, streams run harder and are higher. Of course, we look at the first seasonal shifts of the year, the coming of the mushrooms, which are hilariously large and multicolored in many, many, many specimens of the forest. You really must see it to believe it. Leaf color, of course, setting of seeds and fruits, first frost. There's something going on always in the landscape that tells us of the procession of the seasons. This is called phenology, the study of the regularly occurring seasonal shifts in nature. It's a very, very old practice. It is probably our oldest written biological record. Deep history in Europe and far older in China and Japan, going back thousands of years. In our own country, Thomas Jefferson's records at Monticello are a perfect example of this. At the Harvard University Herbaria and other herbarias throughout the country and the world, you can see these records of plants and how they used to be made. That is the story of the stomata I told you earlier, and other sorts of records. We can see through Thoreau's observations right here at Concord, which are kept at Harvard University in their herbaria. There are many specimens locally extinct today at Concord, plants that he saw not that long ago that are no longer there because of our changing climate. Native plants are hit especially hard. The trick of invasive plants, how they do it so well, is their phenology tends to be longer. They tend to have a longer growing season, and that enables them to get a leg up and to also reproduce deeper into the fall than native plants. So we have a changing land use at the Harvard forest and elsewhere in our country, changing lives in a changing world. But you know, these times we live in can feel so perplexing and overwhelming. I take heart in reading the journals of Thoreau. He was writing a long time ago, 150 years ago, at the peak of deforestation in New England. There was a lot of technological change coming on, the coming of the railroads. Time itself and even physical space was being compressed. People's sense of the world was so turned upside down. It was a time of great economic and social instability and change. Same for us. That actually gives me a sense of hope because I believe in people and I believe in the capacity of innovation and imagination. Just as they remade themselves in that era, I think we can too. Chapter 7, I think change is something we have to really look at hard. When we talk about change, climate change, once again, is a really inadequate and almost stupid term. The climate has always been changing. The planet was once a solid ball of ice, for heaven's sakes. But what's different right now, what's never happened before in geologic time, is the rate of this change. Higher levels of CO2 than in the past 800,000 years, a rate of change unprecedented in recent geologic time. No human has ever breathed this atmosphere, and it is not slowing down. Trees don't lie. I said it before. Here it is. Atmospheric CO2 at 403 parts per million. That's measured in a gauge there at the Harvard forest. You know, these trees are really the witnesses, all of them, to the quickening pulse of the natural world. And the grand challenge now is, how can we understand this better? And one thing that they're doing at the Harvard forest is trying to scale up from observations of one tree, such as John does in those weekly walks, to the biosphere. Well, one way is to change your observational methods beyond only walking. You know, start looking and looking at scale. Drones. There have been lots of controversial stories in the media about drones, but they're really useful tools for science. My friend and collaborator, Steve, at the Harvard University Herbarium in the Richardson lab, can put a camera on this little drone and fly it up in the trees, and he can see, you know, 6 acres of forest in 3 minutes. It would take a long time to walk that many trees. In fact, I don't even think it would be possible. This is called near remote sensing. Not remote sensing like a satellite, near remote sensing. It's about 400 feet off the ground, and you can really see a lot that way. Andrew Richardson in the Green Fleece from the Harvard University and his collaborator, Don Albrecht in the Richardson Lab, are also creating a new kind of observatory, literally a digital observatory. What they've done is they've put towers in the forest, 120 feet high, and put security cameras on them, like a bank security camera, and they watch the canopy throughout the seasonal year and beam images to the internet, so that anyone anywhere can see what seasonal stage the forest is at. And that combined with other kinds of measurements, such as eddy flux covariance, where you look at the actual breathing of the trees and from that extrapolate their rate of carbon sequestration, tells you about the ecological function of the forest. Other kinds of measurements, of course, too, water usage, growth rates, leaf area index, all sorts of ways to get under the hood of the forest and look at how it's functioning today. And this data is transmitted through fiber optic cable directly from the forest to computers all over the world. It's a very heavily wired forest. And you can use this to understand what's going on, the feedbacks between the climate and the forest. Don't forget, the forest has agency of its own, and as we change the climate, the forest is changing its function, which in turn feeds back and changes the climate too. So what are we learning? The value of long-term records, once again. We look at trees with cores and other methods to look at their rate of growth, and we can see that the trees are actually storing more carbon. Red oaks, like mine, are actually bench pressing carbon. They're growing fast as teenagers. Nobody expected that. They thought that as trees got older, their growth rate slowed down. That's actually not what we're witnessing. We also know that their water use efficiency has increased, again, because very often they have fewer stomata now in their leaves, so they're using less water to grow even faster. Even a centenarian like my tree is growing like a teenager. But there are other effects too. With less snowfall, that affects how well insulated the ground is. And what Pam Templer at Boston University is learning, that when you have less snow, the soil freezes more deeply, and that can cause root damage to some species, which can hurt their carbon uptake in the spring, which is obviously a bad feedback loop with climate change, because if a tree can do less by way of sucking up all this CO2 we're putting in the air, it reduces its ability to undercut our pollutants. So what does the future look like? Change is normal in the forest. This we know. It's normal in nature. It is the rule of life everywhere. First, we had the chestnut blight. Took out every tree-sized chestnut in the New England woods and beyond. And now, with warmer winters, the woolly adelgid, a different kind of pest, a little tiny bug, suddenly isn't getting killed off in winters like it used to be, so it's thriving. And sadly, before long, every single hemlock in this forest and beyond is going to be gone. Those beautiful emerald boughs of hemlock that we enjoy in winter, no more. The forest will transform again. Trees have agency. I think when I think about a tree, I used to think it was just sort of standing there. But what I've learned since spending time with my tree and the trees out of the Harvard forest and the scientists who know them well, is that trees are makers of atmosphere. They affect the climate, and they change the places where they live. For instance, at the Harvard forest, with the coming of the trees back, we have the animals. Animals that were rare in Thoreau's time. They never even saw a deer. It was rare enough that he would journal about it if he saw a deer. They're suddenly back. This is a wildlife camera, and you can see this big fat raccoon out for a nice dawn stroll on New Year's Day. That camera is put up right by my tree so I can see who it's keeping company with. The moose are back. The beaver are back. All sorts of changes in the bird life. Why? Because the trees are there, and that has changed the whole environment of the forest. This accidental rewilding, if you will, of New England is one of the great environmental stories and hopes of our time, because it tells us that nature is resilient. My tree could live until 2280. The question is, will it? Our footprints on this earth are joined with others now and in the future, both people and animals. So what of these future generations? My tree, I think of it as a mentor. It doesn't prosper alone, but in a thriving ecology. The same is true for us. Our fates are absolutely shared. Thank you. So I'd love to take questions. We've got some time left. I'm eager to hear anything that's on your mind. Yes. Right, so the question is my book out and in stores? Boy, I wish. I just kind of got into this project last year in the fall, and then I went back to work at the paper for the summer at the Seattle Times, and then I came out and started my Bullard Fellowship in Forest Research at the Harvard Forest in September. So I've been there full-time since, and I have a contract with Bloomsbury Publishing to deliver the manuscript on September 1st. And so I've been continuing my research, spending a lot of time in the woods and writing. So they'll get the manuscript in September. Bloomsbury, by contract, has about 18 months to turn the book around. I bet it won't take that long. So it should be out, sometime next year or the year after. And it'll probably be released, well, certainly nationally in this country, but hopefully even in England. They're big tree people in England. So that's what's going on, and I'm blogging, by the way. I have a website. It's my name, lyndavmapes.com, LYNDAVMAPES.com, no punctuation. And I write all the time there about my research, what I'm seeing, what's going on in the forest, my own questions. And if you're interested in following along the project and being in touch, that's a good place to see what's going on with the book. So I've drafted a few chapters, didn't like them, threw them out, started over. I'm a big outliner. I find that I really need to do a lot of thinking before I can write. And I rewrote my outline on Sunday, actually, and fell to kind of solid ground that I hadn't before. For me, it's almost a physical feeling of, okay, I've really got the story now. And then I started rewriting with a very different kind of zest. On Monday, I wrote the first chapter in a big burst of about 4 hours. Just wrote 28 pages, 4,000 words. It felt wonderful. I revised that on Tuesday, and then yesterday, Wednesday, I started chapter 2. It's a 10-chapter book, probably about 220 pages. So I got a ways to go. My little fill bar is still teeny, but I'm really enjoying it. It's a wonderful subject. I love the forest, I love the tree, I love the people. I love the opportunity to really explore a subject in depth. What I love about this project is it's very intimate. It's one tree. It's using a device of one tree in order to go global, actually, because it does this. It goes very small and close to very big and planetary, and that's fun. I like that rhythm. More questions, more thoughts. Yes. Yes, so the question was, I know you don't like the term global warming or climate change. Is there something else you prefer? And my answer to that is yes, absolutely. And I read a book last year called Eating the Sun by Morton Oliver, and I really recommend it to you if you're interested in this topic. He's a fantastic writer, and in it, he talks a lot about some of these same ideas of how trees function and photosynthesis works and how you can see the changes even within the physiology of trees and leaves because of CO2 increasing. And you know what he calls it? He calls it a carbon crisis. I think that's really interesting because it gets beyond this idea of just temperature. I mean, global warming, as he puts it, sounds kind of pleasant, and it's misleading because the climate, number one, isn't warming everywhere. I mean, and secondly, it's changed before, so it's misleading on two counts. But if you talk about a carbon crisis, that gets to the heart of the matter. It's about there being too much carbon in the atmosphere right now for the living biomass to devour. I mean, it used to be that there was a kind of balance between the amount of CO2 that animals gave off and the amount of CO2 that plants of every sort, including plankton, took in. And so the biosphere was in a kind of balance. And what changed that is the burning of, yes, fossil fuels. This makes sense if you think about it. We're pumping carbon from another age, fossilized carbon, into the atmosphere, and there's not enough living biomass around to suck up not only what we are producing in real time as animals, but also burning stuff from the past. There's just not enough green matter out there to suck up that carbon. So you wind up with excess carbon, which acts as a blanket and all the rest that you already know. So it's really a carbon crisis. I think that's a cleaner way to think about it. It gets to the mechanics of what's really involved. And I think to the extent we think about the Earth as a connected set of systems, it all becomes much more visible and less abstract, because it is, at the end of the day, a geophysical problem. It's a matter of quantities, you know, how much biomass can absorb. And we've actually known about this for a long time. This is not new. I mean, there were scientists 100 years ago who ran experiments and could see that if you increase the amount of CO2, temperatures would rise. I mean, it's not like super tricky at some levels. This is a matter of simple math. Kerry Emanuel at MIT is another really, really good voice on this stuff if you want to explore further and do some more reading on your own. He's a really plain talker, and he gets this. I mean, he just doesn't get all tangled up in a lot of confusion that's irrelevant. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a physical chemical problem. More questions? Yes.
Like you're focused on the constantly changing world that we have and have always lived in, our ancestors. And so a lot of times you hear references to the balance of nature, and as an ecologist, I really struggle with that because I understand that it's appealing. So my question is, you've written about change a lot, not just this book, but your previous book on Moving a Dam about change. And people have a hard time with change. And so I'm just curious if you think about the body of work that you've done, how you try to convey change in a way sort of people can sort of relate to, adopt, maybe not be scared about.
Yeah. So the question is, how can you think about change in a way that it's not quite so scary, that people can not be so put off by it? And I think that one thing that does help actually is to put it in context, so that when we face any challenge, we can kind of step back and suck it up and say, all right, you know, this is pretty intimidating, but my ancestors, they went through a complete change of technology, and they survived it. They didn't know how it was going to come out for them. They had livelihoods that depended on an entire life way that just went away because they were outcompeted in another part of the country. And they managed, they went on, and I think that to the degree that we can not feel alone, and we can take heart in the fact that as a species, we've done this before, over and over and over again. We've adapted and we've changed. And we can be inspired by the natural world. I mean, I think that the fact that in nature, the most productive time is disturbance is inspiring. I mean, when stuff really happens, when nature busts out, it's after the flood, it's after the fire, it's after the earthquake, it's after the big something. That's when the new stuff sprouts. That's when the new sweet of life comes in. That's when the little stuff that's been suppressed in the shade by the status quo suddenly gets a straight shot to the sun. So I like to think of the natural world as a mentor and a source of inspiration. Our ancestors have faced great change and mastered it over and over again. The natural world is an expert in disturbance and recovery, disturbance and recovery. So this is our big disturbance moment. Okay, I say let's just face it and be at least as smart and resilient as an oak tree. Surely we can do that. I think that for me as a writer, as a person, you know, the global warming thing, it's so easy to feel just totally flattened by it and, oh, you know, we'll never make it better. And, you know, the fact is, nature will go on with or without us. The planet will sail on beautifully, even if it has to reset all the way to rock and ice. I just think it would be too bad if we couldn't master a permanent place for our species in this beautiful world to which we are so well suited. Will we be a weedy species that just overruns our niche? Maybe. That could easily happen. You know, we're an accident. We've been here a very short period of geological time. Maybe this is it for us. Maybe we get 100 more generations and it's over. I don't want to believe that. I like to think that, like the other animals on this planet, we can figure out a way to keep a home. But I think we need to remember what our home truly is. It's not just the boxes that we live in, climate controlled and all season diets. It is this living world. We need a thriving nature or we will not survive. And I think we're in this kind of collective amnesia built from this 150 years of technological cocoon that we've brilliantly managed to create for ourselves. And now we need to re-engineer our place in this world so that we all can be here and persist here. The planet will go on. My question is whether we will manage to go on. Yes?
In the slides, you said that your tree could possibly live till 2280.
Right.
But it's growing so fast right now. Could it really sustain that?
The question was, your tree, 2280, really? It's growing so fast. Can it really sustain that? That's a very astute question. There are biologists at the forest who have that same question because we haven't seen this before. We haven't seen red oak growing at this pace and at this sustained pace. Can they continue to keep that up? Will the tree just sort of fall apart? Here's what we do know. Even if the trees do continue galloping along at this rate and taking in more CO2 and growing faster, there won't be enough trees to take care of our problem. We have to reduce our emissions in addition to what the trees can do for us. So, what will happen to my tree? I like to think of a whole range of different possible futures. Maybe we'll get a grip and it can go back to a more normal pace. I don't know what will happen, and it's a question that we don't really know the answer to because we haven't seen a forest like this before. It's a new forest. It looks like we're about out of time. Do we have one more question? Yes, please go ahead. I like that question. So the question was, your tree lives in a rural area. How might it be different if we were in Somerville, a city? I bet you it's not that different, would be my guess, because what we're looking at is the physiology of the tree in this atmosphere, and the atmosphere is the same. So I think probably, if anything, it would be even more accelerated because of the urban heat island effect. Remember earlier in the presentation I talked about Thoreau's observations at Concord. The amount of temperature change at Concord over the past 150 years is huge. It's like 5.6 degrees, much greater than the average temperature change globally, like by 5. And that's because of the urban heat island effect. So if anything, I think if I were telling my story in a city, it would be even more accentuated because the changes have been more extreme. The temperature shift has been bigger over less time. Same atmosphere, but more of a temperature forcing on when spring comes, when winter ends. Now remember, we're talking averages and climate. Last winter, we all froze, didn't we? And spring was actually about 3 weeks late at the Harvard forest. This confuses the conversation a lot. That's just that interannual variability. That's weather, it's not climate. But in terms of climate, I think if I were writing this in a city, probably what we would see would be even more accentuated because of the urban heat island effect.
One more time, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.